Hello, I'm Debbie Kershaw and welcome to JewelleryMaker's Introduction to Metalsmithing. Now we're going to be going through tools, techniques, health and safety, everything that you need to know to get started on this amazing metalsmithing journey. So without any further ado, let's get started. Now I know you're excited to get started and make wonderful pieces of jewellery, but we need to go through the most important thing before we start, and that is health and safety protocols. And it really isn't anything to be scared of, but when you're using your health and safety protocols, you know that you're going to be safe and that you can have confidence to just concentrate on what you're doing, and it's really important. So in this section, we're just going to go through the basic health and safety protocols of getting started with your metalsmithing journey. Now, you've probably noticed I've got a very attractive apron on here, and this is a very important part of sort of the uniform. You know that if I've got my apron on, I mean business. Now this isn't just any apron, it's a suede metalsmithing apron, so that if any sort of hot embers, if anything flies at me, it's not going to go through my clothes, burn my clothes and burn my skin. It's actually going to land on this apron, which is pretty robust, which is going to protect me and my clothes from anything that I'm working with. And of course, sometimes when you're filing metal, the metal goes flying or you get dust, and it can be a little bit of a messy business. So this is a really great idea. Now, the other things that are really, really important that you can't live without, and the first one are some goggles. Now, if you've got some well-fitted eyeglasses, if you wear prescription glasses, you can wear those underneath your goggles. That is absolutely fine. But these will stop, as we were saying, when we're filing metal or working with metal, quite often you can get stray bits of metal flying all over the place, or you can just anything really. And you do not obviously want that to go anywhere near your eyes. So you definitely need a good pair of goggles or safety glasses. And this is an absolute must. So this is a really important piece of kit. And the other thing that we really need is a respirator mask. Now this sounds like I'm not scaring you. I hope I'm not scaring you. It really isn't a scary practice at all. But if you are filing metal, if you are working with flames and acid and things that we'll go through later, you don't want to be breathing those things in as you're working. So a really good respirator mask is what you need. Now, a respirator mask is a mask that has the little pads in the side that you can change. So they actually collect anything in the air in those pads, and then you can change them if you feel that they need changing at any point. And of course, if you have a look at this as well, you'll see that it's got a part that goes over your nose as well as over your mouth, and this particular one has got two straps on the side, so one will sit on the crown of your head and one will sit behind your head, so nothing is getting through this. And you can see inside there as well that you've got those little filtrations that take hold of any dust or metal. Now, a lot of the time when we are working in metal, you will be filing or you will be adding flux, and you'll see what flux is later, and these things have particles that go into the air. So if you just get into best practice of popping one of these masks on every time you work, then you're not going to be doing your lungs any damage at all, because you're not going to be breathing in any of those horrible, nasty things. Now, as far as equipment goes, there's one other thing that isn't essential, but I find that I use it all the time, and it's finger protection. Because when you're working with metal, filing or hammering, or especially manipulating metal, if you file metal a lot or polish metal a lot, it will get hot in your hands to the point where it will burn you. You need to drop it. So finger protection is really, really useful, and there are some different ones that I've got here on my board that you can use. So this is actually finger tape, and I would say this is the one that is most commonly used, and it's really, really good because it just sticks to itself. It doesn't stick to anything else. And what we tend to do is we wrap it around the fingers that we're using, and it will only stick to itself. and then cut it off. So you actually have a ready-made finger protection there that you can use and then discard when you've finished working. Now this is good for if your metal gets hot, not too hot though, but this is very good for if you're filing and you want to protect your skin and your nails. It tends to be a bit of a dirty job with polishing, so this will protect your fingers from any polishing mops or any tools. So this is really, really good. Now the other ones that I use quite frequently are these rubber ones. So these come in different sizes and you can pop them on your thumb or on your finger. So it tends to be sort of these two fingers that you tend to use a lot for holding things. And these come in different sizes. These are also really good for protecting you from heat. So I never really feel any heat on the metal when I'm using these finger protectors. And also if you get them to fit really properly, then you're not going to have trouble holding anything. Now these do come in various different shapes and sizes. You can get smaller ones with sort of the air vent in the top. So if you really needed to use your fingers, you needed to use your dexterity, but you didn't want too much bulk, and these are really good. And then another one that I found recently, these are heat proof, but these are really quite tight. They're like a sock for your fingers. So when you get something like this on your hand, again, you really can get hold of tiny little pieces. So finger protection, really important. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is your environment. So there's something wrong with me standing here like this. It's my long hair. If I lean forward to work with a flame or work with a polishing wheel or anything, my hair can get caught. So always have your hair tied back in your studio, or if you've got a long fringe, you want to take your fringe back away from your face so that I've now got nothing that can get in the way of a flame, nothing that can get caught in any machinery I'm using. So always keep your hair off of your face. And also the clothes you're wearing. If you have got big long sleeves or anything that's gonna come into your workspace, that's no good, because again, you know, your sleeve can get in your work, your sleeve can get in a flame, your sleeve can get caught in a tool. So always have clothes so that they're not going to get in your way at all. The next thing to talk about is your environment, where you're working. Now, unlike beading that you can kind of do on your kitchen table in a corner of your kitchen, you need to have a lot of space when you're working. And you need a well-ventilated area, especially if you're going to be working with a flame, if you're going to be filing and hammering, all the things that you would generally do when you're starting out your metalsmithing journey, you need some space for. So you need to make sure that you're working in a non-cluttered area, especially if you're going to be heating. We'll go on to that a little bit later. So if I had curtains behind me that might blow over my shoulder and into my flame, if I had any shelves with things on that could get in my way, any plants, just make sure that you've got a clutter-free area. So it doesn't always have to be that. It can be somewhere in your house where you can move everything to the side and then move it back when you finish. But just be very mindful of your space, that you've got enough room to work and nothing's going to get in your way. Nothing's going to get caught in that flame or caught in the tools. Now, I hope I haven't frightened you to death. It really isn't a scary pastime, and these things are quite easy things to achieve. Uncluttered space, protect your eyes, protect your lungs, protect your fingers, and get going. So once you have those safety ideas in your head, you always think about them and it just becomes natural. You tend to do those things before you even start. So what do you think? Should we actually get started? Welcome to my favourite section, tools. You can never have enough tools. You can definitely never have enough hammers. Now, there are endless tools that you can play with and you can use with metalsmithing. And today I've tried to get it down to the basic ones that you need when you're starting out, because nobody has all of the bells and whistles when they start anything. And these are, in my opinion, the basic tools of what you need to get started. And I will tell you what they're called and what they do. And then as we move on in future modules, you'll know what you're doing when you come to make something. And when I say get the borax, you won't be going, what's the borax? So let's do it in sections. I'm going to start off with your soldering section. So this is when you heat metal, and there are various reasons that you heat metal. The main one being that you're soldering two pieces of metal together. The other one that you are annealing metal, and there's a section on annealing later which we'll talk about. But for now, we're just going to talk about a basic soldering station. And to start off with, you need a heat-proof surface. Now we do heat-proof mats here at JewelleryMaker, but you can also use a baking tray. Now, you never want to set up anything on a glass table or your best dining table because you don't want to risk damaging, your precious furnishings. So always have a mat underneath this. If you are working on a wooden table, make sure it's sturdy. You don't want it to be wobbling. So a baking tray is great. I've also worked on an old microwave plate from an old microwave because that's heat proof. I've also worked on an old floor tile. So anything that's going to protect your surface from heat. Now the baking tray is pretty good because you can set up on it and then you can move it around. It's portable, so that's good. Now you're going to also need a fire brick or a couple of fire bricks. Now a fire brick is a heat sink. So we would pop our metal on here when we're heating it. So this is what we mean by a fire brick, and it comes in various shapes and sizes. I would say when you're starting out, get two. And for the simple reason that sometimes we like to make a little house when we are heating our metal, because that way it pushes the heat back down and it helps us to heat up our metal. So two is a good idea when you're starting out. And as I say, these come in different shapes and sizes. Now there are a couple of things that will help you but aren't essential, and these are reverse action tweezers. Now these are really good for holding things. So if I need to hold a piece of wire that I'm soldering, I can't have my fingers in there because I can't have my fingers anywhere near the flame. So the reverse action tweezers are really, really good for this because you press here and then once your jaws are closed, they're going to stay like that. So if you've got a ring in there that you want to solder or an earring wire or anything, you can leave that on there holding onto your metal, and then your hands are safe and free, and hopefully they're holding your metal in the place that you want it to be. The other thing you're going to need are some heat-proof tweezers, and we always need tweezers because quite often as we're heating things, which you'll see later, we need to move things around or adjust the position or nudge something back into place. So your heat-proof tweezers are really good, and some of them have wooden ends, a bit more ergonomic. So you definitely need a good pair of heat-proof tweezers. Now this is a solder pick, and this is how we move our solder about or pick up our solder. So a good solder pick is another thing, and probably the most important thing when heating anything is your torch. And we're going to be talking about the torch in detail a little bit later, how we use it, flame control, just the basics to get you started. So this is actually a Durston jeweler's torch, and it's a small torch. It looks a bit like, your creme brulee torches, and you can use those little torches for some of the smaller work. They work absolutely fine for wire and smaller pieces, but obviously if you're using anything for metalsmithing, you wouldn't want to be using that for cooking as well. Everything has to be separate. But you can get these dedicated little jeweler's torches, and these are wonderful because they get really hot. You get the flame that you need, and they work on just lighter fuel, which we'll go through a little bit later when we talk about heating in a bit more detail. And you just need your fuel, which is just the normal lighter fuel that you can get anywhere really, to fill that up. So that's about it for your soldering station, as we like to call it. So you've got your torch, you've got your fire bricks, you've got your equipment that we've talked about, and then we can move this and maneuver it where we need it to be. So I'm going to move this out of the way, and then let's move on to the rest of the tools that you need. So obviously you can get lots of different tools and lots of different things, but to start off with, it's best to just keep with the ones that you'll use the most, and then you can know what you want to add on later. Now, I'm not going to cook a casserole. This isn't my husband's dinner. This is just a slow cooker, a small one. And we put our pickle in here. Now our pickle is actually an acid, and our pickle is an acid that cleans up our metal. When you fire or add a flame to any metal, it will discolour. Sometimes you'll get a fire stain or black marks. And what we do is we heat up the acid. It's just a powder, and you add water and you put it in here. Turn it on and heat it up, and then you just pop your piece into the pickle after you've used any heat on it, and it will come out clean, and you can keep going with the further steps that you need to finish off your piece. So a small crock pot like this, this is a slow cooker. Some people use baby bottle warmers, anything like that, that you're going to be able to sort of heat a small amount of liquid in. That is your pickle pot, and your pickle is the acid that goes inside it. So then we need to come on to just a little heat-proof pot with water in it, and that's your quenching pot. So after you've heated your metal, it's really hot and you mustn't touch it with your fingers. So what you would typically do is pick it up with the tweezers and pop it in water, and you'll hear a really satisfying tss, and your metal is quenched. And then you would take this out usually and pop it in the pickle pot. So doesn't need to be too big. You need a pot that's going to be able to fit your pieces in with a little bit of water in it in your studio. Now you also need a borax cone, which is flux basically. And what flux is you put it on a solder joint and it helps the solder to flow. So it's an essential. Now this comes in various ways. You can buy the liquid in a bottle, and you would just take your paintbrush and pop it onto your solder joints. And we will cover that when we come to the section on soldering, how to do that in detail. But just so you know what I mean when I say flux. So flux can come in a bottle, or mostly when we're starting out, we use it like this. And if you think pestle and mortar, you basically add a little bit of water to your dish, you grind it, and it will give you a little white paste. So you can see the remnants of the white paste that I've used before in that dish. And then you would just get your paintbrush and brush that flux onto your solder joints or wherever else you need it. So that is your borax cone, your dish, and your paintbrush. So that's also sort of comes with the soldering. So we've talked about heating metal and what you might need to do before and after you heat the metal. Well, now we've got how to manipulate metal. So what do we do when we turn a sheet of metal into a hummingbird? We've got to cut it out. So you can get some metal shears for doing this, but you can't tend to do intricate work with metal shears, and they don't usually work on thicker materials. So what every jeweller starts out with is a jeweller's saw. Now this is just your basic jeweller's German saw frame, and we sell them here at JewelleryMaker, and you can pretty much get these anywhere that sells metalworking tools. So you get the frame and then you pop the saw blades in. So again, the saw blades come in different sizes depending on the material that you're working with, and when we come to work with that in later modules, you'll be able to see how to pop that saw blade in and how you would work with it. So a saw frame and a selection of saw blades is an absolute must. Another absolute must is your bench peg. So your bench peg, they come in all different shapes and sizes. This is a JewelleryMaker one, and I think it looks a bit like a spaceship or a Pac-Man. So this is a JewelleryMaker one, and it comes with a clamp, and you clamp it onto your workbench and it faces you. And this is a surface that you can work on, so that you can rest your pieces on, file, saw, metal, whatever you're doing, an absolute must. You cannot live without this. There are different ones. Some of them have just like one peg and you can customize it yourself. This is a nifty one that JewelleryMaker do. So, very inexpensive. I think this was maybe under £20, and this is something you're going to use for years to come. So that is your bench peg. Also a selection of hammers, or if you're starting out, you can basically get away with 2 hammers. One hammer which marks your metal, so you may want to hit your metal to add some texture to it. You may want to hit your metal to work harden it, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And that you would need your metal hammer. So this is a ball peen hammer. On one side you have the ball, which you can make different textures, and the other side is flat. So if your metal distorts while you're working with it, you can flatten in it. So these are pretty inexpensive and a must. So you need one metal hammer, and then the other sort of hammer that you're going to need is a rawhide mallet or a nylon hammer. The difference between these two really is you can hammer your materials with this and it won't mark it at all. It will just make it stronger or help you to form the shape. For example, if we were making a ring and we wanted to get that round shape and we were hammering, this would help us get the shape, but it wouldn't make a mark in your metal. Whereas this would also help us get the shape, but it would mark on metal. So sometimes you want that because having a nice texture on your metal is really nice. And then we have got, talking of making rings, a ring mandrel. Now these typically come with your sizes along one side so that you can know what size ring you're making, and also it's made of steel so that you can work around it. So if I took a piece of wire and I bent it around this ring mandrel to make it nice and round, and then I would typically use my hammer to keep that shape. So that's your ring mandrel. And then lastly for this section, an absolute must is your steel block. Now you can see mine's been very well loved and very well used. This is a steel block and it's just what it says on the tin. It's a block of steel, and this is a surface that we use so much to do texturing, to hammer, to work on. It's really, really important piece of kit, and that's something that we need. It's an essential. And there's one other thing that's not so essential, but I suppose it depends where you live, whether you think it is or not, and that is your rubber block. So your rubber block is the same as your metal block, but it's rubber. And what this does, if you pop your metal block on top of it when you're working down on your table, it helps the shock from your furniture, and it also dampens the noise. So if you're hammering a lot and you've got, you know, neighbours, or you want to be quiet, then one of these is really great. So they are the main tools that we have for cutting, shaping our metal and the surfaces that we are working on. So I'm just going to move this out of the way, and then I'm just going to bring in the last one, I promise. I've gone, here's the few tools you need 3 hours later. This is when we have cut our metal, we've soldered it, we've put it in the pickle, we need to finish off. Now finishing is everything, and I'll show you a little bit more about this later when we talk about materials. But you might have sawed a beautiful flower out of a sheet of copper, but usually when you've sawn, you will get a rough edge. It won't be shiny and polished as you would see a finished piece of jewellery. So you have to do those things, and it's called finishing. And the finishing often will make the piece of jewellery. And there's a few things that you need for this finishing process. Now, the first one being needle files. Now these come in all different shapes and sizes, and they'll usually come in a set. So this is a JewelleryMaker set of needle files. It's just 3. I think you get about 10 or more in the set, and they're all different shapes. So if you think of all the little nooks and crannies you'd need to get into with your files to either refine your shape, or maybe you need to get rid of rough edges, or you've got a little curve that you just want to make a little bit deeper, these are the tools that you need for that. So they're little, they can get into little spaces and really help, especially if you're starting out and your sawing skills are new. This can help you finish off and get that desired effect. So these are the small needle files, and then you'll also need one larger file. The larger file is really good as well because this can just get rid of excess metal. So maybe you have sawn out a flower and one of the petals is a little bit larger than the others, and you just want to get rid of some excess metal. So you can do that with this. This one is flat on one side and round on the other side. You can get them just flat. So one larger file as well is really useful. And then to finish off and actually get that lovely high shine that you see on finished pieces of jewellery, you need to do polishing. Now there's all sorts of polishing paraphernalia that you can get, a rotary tool as you go on with your journey. But at this point, a lot of us started off with a simple sanding block. So this is just what you'd use for your nails. You've probably seen it in the chemist, and it has different grits of sandpaper on each end. So obviously you'll have a coarse one, and then it will work down to the finest. And if you rub this over the top of metal, it will start to take out any scratches and really bring your metal up to a high shine. Now you can either use something like this, or you could actually use different grits of sandpaper to do it, that, you know, to smooth off and to just finish off those pieces. Now these sandpaper can come in sticks, so you can actually get it on sticks, which makes it a little bit easier to use. So that's a triangle one. This is a half round. They come in all different types, but obviously this is quite easy to hold and work with. So basically you need a section of files, a selection of sandpapers in whatever form, and lastly a polishing cloth. So a polishing cloth you would use now probably to give your rings or your bracelets a bit of a polish up. A polishing cloth is really, really great for just, you know, giving that finished, professional, lovely look. You spent all this time making your jewellery and you want it to look really professional and really lovely. So now you know the health and safety. I've talked to you through the tools. Let's get on to the materials that we typically need to start working with metal. In this section, we're going to be talking about the materials. So we've talked about health and safety, we've talked about the tools, some of the tools that you might need. Let's talk about the materials that we commonly work with when we're working with metal. Most people that I know, and myself included, when we started out, we worked with copper. And copper comes in various forms. It can come in a sheet form. Look at those lovely fingerprints all over that. And these sheets actually come in different thicknesses depending on what you want to make. So you can get sort of quite thin ones working up to thicker ones depending on what you're making. And copper is much less expensive than something like sterling silver or gold. So it's really great to work with this when you start out because you're not worrying about making a mistake. If you make a mistake, it's not costing you a lot of money. You can start again. And as I always say, a mistake is a learning process. So you probably won't do that again, or you'll find a different way to do it. So it's learning, and copper is really great for learning. Now you can get copper in sheet. You can also get copper in different wires, and we'll talk about different wires in a moment. Now you can also work with brass, which is another inexpensive or relatively inexpensive material. The only thing about brass is it can be a little bit tricky to work with when you start out. Just the heating is slightly different, the way it behaves is slightly different. So unless you've worked before with brass, and if you are a complete beginner, which I assume you are if you're watching this, then I would keep the copper for a little bit, the brass rather, for a little bit later. Now what we all really love to use is silver and gold, and I know some metalsmiths that have never used gold, they just work in silver. But I would say the next step up is your sterling silver. Now sterling silver, again, comes in a sheet form, and this is what we'd call an unfinished sheet, because as you can see, it's not shiny, it doesn't probably look like a piece of silver, but it will do after it's finished, or it comes in finished sheet. Now you can see the difference, can't you, there? So that finished sheet, you can see, looks like it could be made into a piece of jewellery. It's got a texture already on there, it's been polished, it's been filed. So those are the two different types of sheet in the sterling silver, and you'll be able to get those in all of the metals. This is just in the sterling because I think it gives you a really good indication of unfinished sheet and finished sheet. So you can see how different the sizes are as well. Silver is more expensive generally to buy than your copper. So your different sheets are what we work with to say, let me see, this is a ring base that I've made here, and it's got like the sieve in the middle, it's a flower, so that I will be weaving in and out some beads ultimately, and it's just soldered onto a basic ring band. Now this flower started life as a piece of sheet, so that has been drawn on, it's been sawed out, and then it's been manipulated to make the flower shape, and then it's had holes put in it. So a lot of the larger things that we make are made out of our sheet. Now, if I show you, I'm going to bring you a necklace in as well. The finish sheet with the texture on was used to make these little clover motifs. So this again started out as sheet. It's just been made into little clover motifs with chain in between, and that's sterling silver. So that started out its life as sheet as well. And then going to the complete other extreme, this is copper. And this is a copper ring that I made, so it's like a shadow box effect. I've put some coloured patina in there. But if I show you it from the side there, you can see that it's domed. That also started out life as just a humble little flat piece of metal sheet. And that's why I love this hobby so much, because you can take something that looks like this and you can make it into a piece of jewellery. So that's your metal sheet. And if we're looking at rings, one of the I think most requested designs from people who start making with metal is stacker rings, because they're really nice and simple to make. And these are rings made out of wire. So to think that this started life just as a piece of wire. Now you can get lots of different types of wire. You can get half round wire, square wire, blah, blah, blah. Lots and lots of different types of wire. But really you just need to think about the thickness of the wire, what you're making and what you need it for. So this is just round wire. You can also get flat wire. So if you were maybe setting a stone and you wanted to make a casing for your stone, a bezel, then you might use this wire. You can get fancy wire, so you can get, this is like little bobbles of metal, and that makes a lovely ring shank or a lovely stacking ring. So you can use something like that. So believe it or not, this is a chain that I made myself, and it literally is just out of this wire. So it's just shaping and soldering the little links, making sure they're all the same size and putting them together. So that just started life as a piece of wire. And you can get really decorative ones as well. There's a piece of bezel wire here, and it's just got sort of like, it looks like a little crown. It reminds me of a crown. So if you were bezel setting maybe a cabochon stone or anything like that, then you can use this wire. So really you are just dealing with sheet and wire, and the different wires for different things. So I've got here a bangle, and this is probably a classic bangle that you'd buy or that you'd wear, and this is a D-shaped wire, so it's basically got a D shape on one side and flat on the other, so it's comfortable to wear. This is a square wire, and I've just actually shaped this so that it's got some different dimensions and interest to it, and I've popped some charms on there. So again, these two were made just with wire. So really, wire and sheet are the two main ingredients of getting started with your metal working journey. Now, the other main ingredient that we need is when we're soldering. So we've made our lovely ring shank out of our lovely wire. We've made our lovely flower out of our sheet. We've got to put those two things together, and we've got to put them together and solder them. And there's something very important that we need when we're soldering, and that is solder. And solder comes in a couple of different forms. Now, a very simple form of solder, which is quite easy to use, is solder paste. Solder paste is just what it says, it's a paste, and you would just apply pressure here and your solder paste just comes out of the end. Now this already has flux in it. We talked about the borax earlier. You don't need to add borax when you use this. It melts quite well, so this is a really good one for beginners. It can be a little bit more expensive than the solder sheet, but it is easier to use in my opinion. So this is your solder paste. Also, we have solder sheet, which actually looks like metal sheet, and it comes in these little metal sheets. Now I've got letters on there because I'm going to explain about solder in just a moment, but you need different types of solder to work with your metal. Now usually we would cut these up into tiny little pallions, and we would use those to add to our metal. So believe it or not, these little ones will last ages. And if I show you inside my box, it might be easier to show you on the overhead. Can you see those teeny tiny little, that is actually my solder that has been cut up into different sizes that I would add to my joints so that I could solder my pieces of metal together. Now there are maybe 4 different types of solder, and you'll see that I've written it on the top here because you don't want to get them mixed up. Extra easy, easy, medium and hard. And you're like, what? Debbie, what are you talking about? And basically, the simple way to describe these is they have different melting points. So if you're just doing one soldering joint, for example, if you're making a stacking ring and you have got your wire, you've made it round, and you just need to join it together, then we would just use, we only need one solder joint, we're only going to do it once. We would pop on the hard solder. And the hard solder is the one that it takes the longest to melt. And they come down from there. So the medium solder takes not quite as long to melt. And the easy solder is much quicker to melt. And the extra easy solder melts quicker. Why do I need that? You basically need that if you're going to solder more than one joint. And we will go into this in a lot of detail with demonstration in the soldering section. But just to explain why you need different solders, this ring, for example, I had to solder it more than once. So I had to solder it once to make the ring, make it round, make sure it doesn't come apart. And then I had to solder it again to connect my flower to the ring. So that's 2 solder joints. Now, sometimes you can get away with using the same solder on both sides, but basically when you're a beginner, what might happen, you've soldered this, you're really happy, and then you go to solder this and this one pings open because they both melt at exactly the same time. If you've used hard solder to do the ring band, and then you use medium or any other solder to do the rest of it, this is going to melt way before this does, so this one will stay intact. But you don't have to worry about that too much at this point. We will go into detail in that in the soldering section, but that's just a brief explanation of why you need different solders. So sheet, wire and different solders, they are the main materials that we use when we're starting out in our metal smithing journey. In this section, we're going to be talking about your torch and flame control. And I wish someone had spoken to me about flame control when I first started out, because when I talk to people, the main thing they say is that they're a little bit scared of the torch, a little bit scared of the flame. And if you know how to use your torch confidently and what's going to happen when you heat up metal, then you can work with a confident mindset, and you don't need to be afraid of your torch at all. We've talked about health and safety, so you've got a health and safe workspace, and you need to know your way around your torch, and we will be covering this in much more detail in future modules, but here we're just going to get a feel about how to use your torch and how to get hotter and cooler flames, which part of the flame is the hottest, and just a little intro, I suppose, to using your torch. So the one I've got here is the Durston Jeweler's torch, and it's the smaller one, but it packs quite a mighty punch. It can hit some really good temperatures, which is what you want when you're working with a small torch. So if you have a look here, you've got the stand, which is great because that makes sure that if you put it down and you put it down on your stand, it won't tip over. And before you use your torch for the first time, you have to fill it up. So I showed you in the tools section the gas, the lighter fluid, and it's just got a little, just like you would fill up a lighter, it's got the little space at the bottom where you pop in your fuel and you just press it in and you'll hear it and it fills up your torch. And filling up your torch, it will actually, depending on what you're doing, it lasts quite a long time before you have to fill it up again. Now this part here is your trigger, and this is what ignites lights your flame once you turn the torch on. This is your on and off button, and you can also adjust the strength of your flame with this button. Now, all of the torches are different and they don't all have all of the bells and whistles on. This one has everything that you need on, but this little tiny red button at the side here, this is a lock. So if you wanted to keep your flame going and not hold on to your trigger, then you can pop that down and it will lock your flame. Alternatively, if you've just got that sitting on your workbench and you just want to lock it just to make sure that you're safe, then you can use that. So let's get started on actually firing this up. So to begin with, you need to just turn on your gas, and you don't need to turn it on. You'll hear it, it will start to hiss. And then you just trigger and it lights so that you've got that flame. A bit difficult to see the flame here in the studio with our lights, but you can make it stronger. So I'm turning it up so you can see and hear that that's stronger. And then I can also turn it down for a weaker flame. Now typically that you can see there that there is a blue flame. At the tip of that blue flame is the hottest part of your jeweller's torch. Now if you were looking at this without the studio lights, you'll see a flame beyond that which is yellow, and that will protrude beyond. Now always be careful, just turn that off, always be careful of where you're pointing your flame. When I was learning to work with metal, quite often you'll be heating something and then you'll think, oh, I need to take my flame off. But you've got to remember that when you take your flame off, it's still on. So if I went, oh, and I pointed over there, I'm going to set fire to something. So that's why you need to have your little station so that if you do move that away, you aim it at your fire brick or you aim it somewhere safe. You don't just aim it into fresh air. And you're not going to do that really, because you can always just turn it off with the switch. So that's your torch. And let's talk about how we're going to use that in your basic setup. So we've got our fire brick, and this is a heat sink, and sometimes we spoke earlier about you might need two of them if you're making a little house, if you essentially want to heat your metal so it's a little bit hotter, but we're just going to work with one fire brick. Now I also have my tweezers so that if I need to move anything about whilst I'm heating, I can do. Never want your fingers to touch anything, because that's going to be really, really hot. Now what I'm going to do here, and I hope we can be able to see it under the lights, is this is just a scrap piece of silver. I'm going to heat it up and I'm going to show you the different colours that the metal goes while we're heating. And this is a really great indication of when your metal might have reached that melting point where it's just about to melt. So if you've spent a really long time making a lovely heart and you're soldering it together with another lovely heart, and you put too much heat on there, you can melt the metal. And I'm sure every single jeweller has done that and continues to do that at some point. It's just a learning process. It happens. Even the most advanced jewellers, sometimes that will happen too. But I think it's great to just to start off, just to heat metal and familiarise yourself with how long it takes for it to melt, what colour it goes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the annealing section, which is next. But let's have a look at what happens to the metal when we heat it up. So I'm going to turn on my gas like I did before. I'm making sure now that my flame is going to be pointed at my fire brick. Now I've got it on quite a low flame here, and I don't know if we can see that on the overhead, that metal will start to change colour. So depending on what I'm doing, I might feel now that, oh, that's too hot. I need to take my flame away. Now you saw that went bright red. That was just about to melt, and I'll show you what happens if it melts. And I think it's invaluable for everybody who's starting out. Can you see that's melting? To see how long it takes you to melt a piece of metal. So I've actually turned that now into a ball of molten metal, and it's gone into a ball. Now that is boiling hot, and this is what happens when we're talking about quenching. You can pick it up with your tweezers and listen. It makes that really satisfying sound. So that has basically made my metal nice and soft. Now if I show you that on the overhead camera, can you see the colour that's gone now? So we were talking about the pickle pot earlier, weren't we? We weren't cooking a casserole, we had our pickle in there, which is an acid. So what I would do now is pop that into my pickle solution, and that will get away all that black, and it will turn it back to silver again, and it will clean it. So if now I was going to, say, want to solder that onto the top of a ring, if I did it now, there are chances are it wouldn't work because the metal is dirty. Now, that was a pretty thin piece of metal sheet, and you saw that that did not take a really long time to melt. It didn't take a long time at all, and I was on a low flame. If you have thicker wire or thicker sheets, it will take longer to melt. But a great thing to do when you first start out is get some copper wire, get some copper sheets, and have a play. See how long that is going to take to melt. Have a practice turning your torch on and seeing what the flame looks like when it's bigger and seeing what the flame looks like when it's smaller. Practicing taking your flame away, not panicking, just taking it away. Sometimes you might want to keep that flame on. You don't want to turn it off because you might need it again. And you can always take your flame away from your metal at any time. If you think, that I'm waiting for the solder to flow, I don't want my piece to melt, I'm not sure, just take the flame away. That's never going to harm. So actually familiarising yourself with your torch, the different flames, and just really playing with metal, seeing the different colours that metal goes, will help you enormously with your confidence when working with a flame. Now, we will go into this in much more detail in the soldering section so that you will see how long it takes your solder to flow, depending on the piece that you're making, and we'll be making pieces and showing you it in action. But it's a really good idea to, when you get your torch, fill it up, have a play with it, and just make sure that you know what you need to do if you need to turn it on, you know how to make your flame bigger, you know how to make your flame smaller. Now, your torch might be slightly different to mine, but they all basically work in the same way. You have your on and off with the gas, you have your trigger. Some of them don't have a trigger, some of them are less expensive, so you would light them with a lighter. So the gas comes on and you light them with a lighter, but most of them do. So it's a bit like your creme brulee torch, and that is your basic flame control. So if you get used to your torch, you get used to your flame before you start making any jewellery, then you're already a few steps ahead in your metal smithing journey. Now, the next section really ties nicely into this. It's about annealing. So you need a flame when you're annealing, and we're going to talk about what that is, why we need it, and how to do it in the next section. Hello, welcome to the annealing section. So we're going to talk about annealing. What is it? Why do we do it? And how do we do it? So anytime that you manipulate metal in any way, whether it be saw it, hammer it, shape it, it gets harder, and that's called work hardening. So you might start off with a piece of metal that you can bend with your fingers. And then by the time you've worked on that, you might be stamping some letters in, you might be adding some texture. When you go to form it, you won't be able to move it at all, because every time you work on it, the molecules inside compact together and they make your metal harder. So to continue working on a piece, sometimes you have to anneal it, and that is just a metal smithing word for making it softer again. So maybe I've textured this and then I want to start to form it and move it and make it into a three-dimensional shape. And I can't because it's just too hard. So that's when you need to soften the metal. So let's have a little look at why we might need to do this. So as you saw, I can move this sheet at the moment with my finger, so it's nice and soft. So I've popped it on my metal block, and I might want to pop some texture into this metal sheet. So we saw some sheet that already had a texture on it earlier, but this one is just plain. So I've got my ball peen hammer, so we've had a look at this in tools as well. This side of it is really great for making your textures. So I'm going to start, this is going to be loud, I'm going to So I've deliberately just done that little corner. So you can see there that I've got a texture here and the rest is plain. And if I come to polish that, you'll really, really see that texture. But just from hammering that, now this corner is really, really tough. I can't move that now because I've work hardened it. So I need to anneal it. So I'm going to show you how you can anneal your metal. So I need to move my block out of the way, and I'm going to bring in, once again, my soldering station. And I'm just going to pop my sheet actually down onto my fire brick. And annealing, it sounds like, you know, a confusing name, but it just basically means that we're going to soften that metal again so that we can work on it. So we gently heat the metal so that it begins to soften up. We quench it in our quenching pot, and then we'll be able to work on it again. Now, annealing's a tricky one if you're not used to your metal melting points. And there's a little tip or trick that usually works for me when annealing. If you get a permanent marker and you just pop it, and don't worry because that's going to come off, if you just pop that on the part of your metal that needs to be annealed, and usually it would be a smaller piece than this, I've just grabbed a scrap piece. Now I'm going to heat the metal until that permanent marker disappears, and then I know that my metal's annealed. So you're kind of looking for, depending if you're working with copper or silver, an orange kind of colour to your metal, which is a bit more difficult to see under these studio lights and with copper than it is with silver. When it starts going cherry bright red, it's about to melt. So you're looking for kind of like a dull orange colour. Now, if you can't see that colour very clearly, then doing this adds that confidence of when that permanent marker disappears, my metal has softened. So let's have a go. I'm going to turn on my torch. I've got my torch pointing at my metal. I'm using a medium flame here, and I'm going to heat my metal so I can still see my Sharpie, and there it's gone. Now I think you can see that burnt orange colour there, can't you? So it gives you that extra confidence of knowing that now that permanent marker has actually disappeared. I know I can't touch that with my hands because it's super hot, so you would need your tweezers. If you pick that up with your tweezers and then pop it in your water, popping that metal into the water helps it to become even softer. So if you were heating up, say, a pair of earring wires, and you didn't really want those earring wires to be any softer because it's a tiny little bit, then you let it cool down naturally. If you want something to be even softer, or you want to help with the annealing process, then you would pop that into water. The only time you wouldn't is if you had stones in it, but that's way down the line, that's way down your journey. So really, heating until that permanent marker disappears, or you've got that dull orange colour, quench it in your water, and then have a play. Has that gone as soft as I need it to go? If it hasn't, you can do the whole process again. You can pop it onto your block, heat it up, quench it in your water. Oh yes, that's soft, I can carry on working on it. And you can do that as many times as you want to within making a piece. If you are going to solder, then you may need to just pop that into your pickle a few times to clean it up, because solder does not like to flow on dirty metal surface. It likes really clean surfaces so that the solder will flow efficiently, and we'll cover that in the soldering module. But just for now, annealing is simply that, using your torch to heat your metal so that you soften it so that you continue working on it, and you can do that as many times as you wish. So that's not difficult, that's all there is to it. That's annealing in a nutshell. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to metalsmithing, and I hope you feel really confident to start your journey with working with metal. We've talked about health and safety, we've talked about the tools you need, the flame you need, so you're armed with all of the information you need to make really beautiful pieces of jewellery, and we'll be going through how to make those in more detail in future modules. Don't forget to check out JewelleryMaker TV for tools and materials that you might want to use, and I'll see you again really soon.